Early February 1917 saw global headlines stir up turmoil by reporting that Germany had resumed its unrestricted submarine warfare policy. This move resulted in the rupture of diplomatic relations between Germany and the United States. This marked a major shift in the conflict, then called the Great War. Yet hundreds of miles away from the intensifying naval battles, the Eastern Front was gripped by severe cold. The setting was a wooded area encompassing modern-day Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus. For German and Russian troops, U-boat warfare was the least of their worries. These soldiers definitely endured harsh conditions. However, the war and extreme weather seemed to have impacted many more people beyond just the troops. Consequently, the already dangerous surroundings would present even more unforeseen difficulties. Soldiers from both armies would soon face a worse ordeal, not realizing they were being stalked by a shared adversary. That winter was incredibly cold, making me want to weep. Actually, I never really cried, but I had never felt such a strong urge, even during shelling reinforcements. So we returned to the front line at the same spot above Beaucourt. It was early February 1917, and the conditions were extremely harsh. We had never experienced such a cold winter. The situation at the well was dreadful. There wasn't a proper front line. Instead of a continuous trench, we had tiny foxholes. The ground was so frozen, it was like bricks, impossible to dig further. By the 1916-1917 winter, the Eastern Front extended over 1,000 miles from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Although enormous in scope, the Eastern Front was deemed less critical. The Western Front, with battles like the Somme, was seen as the decisive theater where the war would ultimately be settled. Victory was achieved by soldiers such as the British troops fighting near France's borders. Meanwhile, in early 1917, both German and Russian forces were deployed along the mountainous front lines of the German Empire. They found it hard to keep up their fighting spirit because the awful conditions alone were almost unbearable. The Russian troops at the front would quickly lose all hope of winning. As demoralized soldiers in the rear increasingly deserted, Russia plunged into complete chaos, marked by several civil wars and revolutions, eventually leading to Lenin's Bolshevik Revolution that year. Yet the men remaining on both sides stayed sheltered in their shallow foxholes, trying to evade constant barrages of machine gun fire, artillery, and shrapnel, plus poison gas and precise sniper shots. Water-cooled machine guns malfunctioned or stopped working because their water jackets were frozen solid. Troops often had to heat their rifles over fires just to make them work. Compasses failed, causing entire regiments to wander blindly in forests during blizzards. Food and supply shortages affected the whole region and much of Europe. The meager rations froze, along with water, making eating hard and denying them any comfort. Chewing ice for hydration only worsened their suffering. Soldiers who took off their boots to ease trench foot or for relief struggled to get them back on. With their feet increasingly swollen, exhausted soldiers fought to stay awake through long winter nights, trying to avoid frostbite or death from cold while enemy shells fell around them. Sleep was a rare luxury. The physical and psychological impact of battle stress, along with these compounding factors, was immense. As if their suffering were not enough, reports in mid-February started making new headlines, tales far more bizarre than most war correspondence. American newspapers startled readers with accounts of wolves attacking and devouring Russian and German soldiers on the front lines. These reports, cited as coming from Russian officials in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, claimed the attacks happened in wooded regions near modern Vilnius and Minsk, along the borders of present-day Poland, Lithuania, and Belarus. It seems a starving wolf population had no choice. With no other prey, they turned to humans. Despite the news articles, little detail exists about the horrors soldiers faced in these wolf attacks. Several accounts describe repeated wolf attacks rather than a single occurrence. The main report says that during an intense engagement, perhaps a German assault to push back or overrun the Russians, a huge wolf pack boldly ran into the battle and started eating wounded soldiers, some probably still alive. The articles note that, surprised by the wolves, both Russians and Germans instantly stopped shooting each other and aimed their rifles and grenades at the pack, honorably protecting the wounded from both sides. After about 50 wolves were killed, the rest scattered, leaving the soldiers to awkwardly resume their battle. Following such truce stories, both sides quietly chose to recover their wounded and return to their foxholes, fighting another day. Articles suggest the desperate wolves, though reduced in number, soon came back in strength, attacking units during skirmishes or ambushing men in foxholes and trenches. These accounts portray the wolves as increasingly ravenous, undoubtedly starved and mad with hunger. The wolves became such a nuisance that Germans and Russians started sending out small hunting parties to kill them or tried poisoning the animals. When this didn't repel the ravenous wolves, the men reportedly had no option but to negotiate with the enemy. They may have exchanged messengers to arrange a ceasefire in wolf-affected areas. Once agreed, they could leave their cold positions without fear of snipers or artillery, concentrating on hunting. They focused solely on hunting wolves before the wolves could hunt them. Whether German and Russian hunting parties eventually merged is speculative but not unlikely. Reports say they killed hundreds of wolves before the ceasefire ended, after which they resumed their grim war. Given that the accounts rely on only a few American newspaper articles from February to late July 1917, a question remains: is this story actually true? The answer may be purely speculative. At least a few modern skeptics have tried to debunk it, mainly because they can't find corresponding Russian records of a wolf truce. However, these skeptics don't specify which sources they consulted, which raises the question: how thorough was their research before dismissing the many newspaper reports as false? No alternative justification or expertise is given for their deductive reasoning. In contrast to the doubt surrounding the notion of wolves attacking soldiers during a large-scale conflict, the concept of the most severe winters in a century appears not only accurate, but also very likely given those exact conditions. An awareness of human history coexisting with wolves is certainly present. A comparative study of historical wolf attacks on humans, especially accounts involving numerous wolves hunting together, thus breaking their usual territorial behavior, seems the most effective method to confirm much of the story's strangeness. Although wolves may not have the intelligence to declare war on humans and apparently lack the emotional capacity for contempt, it seems that over the centuries, mankind has nevertheless declared war on wolves. This was driven both by self-defense and competition for various resources. If these tales seem unbelievable, it might be due to our modern worldview in the 21st century. So, we must remember the history of human existence. Despite our intellectual superiority, mankind has always faced a constant struggle to survive against the numerous unforgiving forces of nature over these past millennia. Our gathering into well-defended communities and the amenities of modern civilization have stripped us of survival abilities and sharpened instincts we once required to stay alive. Indeed, for a long time now, it appeared we are much more likely to be killed by another human than by a predatory animal. This threat of an early and violent death is much more certain for our soldiers engaged in combat. While modern comforts may shield us from the once unavoidable forces of nature, we may have largely remained the top species in most environments over time. Occasionally, humans have unexpectedly become the hunted rather than the hunter when it comes to animal predation. Men fighting in wars, who thus find themselves far from home in unfamiliar and often harsh environments, stranded on the open ocean or in the vast wilderness of foreign lands, appear to be no exception. Quite the opposite, it seems. In any case, since we expect soldiers to be routinely exposed to dangerous conditions, unusual stories of predatory animals attacking them understandably generate a great deal of curiosity. Such stories include the reported tiger attacks during the Vietnam War, as well as the shark and crocodile encounters reported during World War II. According to R.P. Stalerza in his paper titled Wolves, Humans, and the Democratization of Poland, wolves and humans have competed for resources. They also competed for the position of top predator. This competition has existed at least since humans became efficient enough hunters to stop being mistaken for easy prey in Europe. The clear winner of this competition was not determined until the 19th century. Industrialization, the agricultural revolution, and the resulting population explosion allowed humans to tip the scales in their favor. If not for humans, wolves would likely remain a top predator across much of the northern hemisphere. This is due not only to their high intelligence but also to their social behavior. However, the predation of humans by wolves has become a very rare occurrence in recent years, especially in the more developed regions of the world. One of the most obvious reasons is that we have long learned to trust our instincts and avoid putting ourselves in dangerous environments. Additionally, following Stella's line of thinking, hunting wild game has largely become a recreational activity for humans rather than a necessity. Instead of foraging and tracking down prey, we now hunt for rations in the much safer environment of our local grocery stores. We certainly avoid swimming in shark-infested waters when we can help it, and we rarely venture into unfamiliar stretches of wilderness alone or without proper protection. But there have always been those among us, including our soldiers, who are not so fortunate as to always have that choice. And so inevitably they find themselves thrust into increasingly hazardous environments. It can be said that more recent stories of wolves attacking humans, and certainly soldiers, are therefore the result of an unfortunate culmination of otherwise abnormal circumstances. The wolves are starving, suffering from rabies, or otherwise provoked by careless individuals, as modern conservation efforts would suggest. In some parts of the world, primarily North America, we now nobly strive to conserve endangered wolf populations. Those which had until the mid to late 20th century been freely exterminated either out of irrational fear or for our own safety and protection of livestock, while many of us may have the luxury of ascending Maslow's hierarchy. With our needs for survival and safety met through our access to modern conveniences, our view of the world is not universally shared by those humans living in harsher, less developed regions over the centuries. And certainly even today, it should thus be stated here that despite our modern appreciation of these beautiful animals, the hunting of wolves is still legal. It is legal in many regions of Europe, Russia, and across Asia, as well as in North America. The modern-day justifications for the hunting of wolves, and more specifically the culling of wolf populations, remains a controversial issue. As humans seek to protect themselves and their vital livestock while living in relative harmony with both local wolf populations and the greater environment, however, despite our more contemporary sense of compassion for wolves, those humans living in wolf-inhabited regions across the Eurasian continent over the last several centuries clearly held far less favorable opinions towards these predators. And for good reason. Wolf attacks on humans were not always uncommon. International headlines in 2017 reported that a number of wolves had been spotted in the forests surrounding the city of Paris. This news might seem unremarkable, if not for the fact that wolves had apparently been eliminated from the country of France in the 1930s. Completely wiped out by farmers and hunters, Eurasian wolves had under various conditions occasionally considered humans to be a convenient source of food. Europe's recorded history indicates that wolves had long been a thriving species on the continent. And for those unfortunate European citizens who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time, European history recounts thousands of predatory, rabid, and otherwise unprovoked wolf attacks on humans. From the more mundane stories of individual attacks to the now fabled accounts of man-eating wolves who killed so many humans, either alone or as leaders of their packs, that they were given memorable titles: the Great Corto and the Wolves of Paris in the Vaux, 1430, the Wolf of Ansbach in 1685, the Wolf of Suissal and the Beast of Gevedol in the 1760, the Wolf of Jessinge in the 1820s, and the Wolves of Turku in the 1880s. As the European continent plunged into the First World War, wolves were no less notorious during the conflict. Early one morning in mid-January of 1915, a massive earthquake shook the mountainous Abruzzo region of Italy. In the town of Pessina, 3,500 of the town's 50,000 residents died in a matter of 30 seconds, crushed by the sudden collapse of their homes. Reporting of the various rescue and relief efforts invariably included reports of wolves, which had come down from the surrounding mountains in search of not only loose sheep, but the wounded residents. Decomposing bodies were buried in the rubble, and the frenzied wolves were even attempting to attack vehicles that passed by them on the roads. Surviving residents and possibly rescue workers organized hunting parties to eliminate the now fearless wolves. They likewise killed over 100 local dogs that had also been caught scavenging the corpses among the ruins. As Russian and German troops fighting along the Eastern Front 2 years later would inevitably realize, a combination of large-scale war and uncommonly brutal temperatures may have, like the uncommon Italian earthquake, created compromising conditions for the region's wolf population. While the contributing factors vary from one occurrence to another, Several large-scale wolf encounters indicate wolves will resort to attacking humans. One such encounter occurred as recently as 2012, and wolves resort to attacking humans when their usual food supply is significantly compromised. It might be speculated that the availability of hundreds of human corpses during World War I and II contributed to, if not instigated, these attacks. During the war, when soldiers died from injuries or due to harsh conditions, their bodies would be buried as the front lines moved forward. However, as winter approached, the ground froze and became impossible to dig, so the bodies remained exposed, littered across the various battlefields of the region. As species of wolves inhabiting these regions of Europe and Russia are notably larger than most, their diet demands a larger consumption of meat. They are known to consume as much as 6 to 7 pounds per day. War undoubtedly caused a great amount of disruption to the local environment, scattering the wolves' usual game. This left them desperate to satisfy their large appetite by scavenging the human corpses. Without those corpses, humans would have otherwise remained an infrequent source of prey. To make matters worse, the war itself had conversely created the opportunity for unfettered growth of the wolf population. In the years leading up to 1917, the men in those regions were no longer hunting them. Willengrave, in his book Wolves in Russia, a compiled dissertation of 50 years of research on Eurasian wolves, states that during the 20th century, the greatest number of wolves in Russia occurred during World War I and World War II. When men were called off to war, the general populace of Russia had few firearms. He continues that in the absence of men and without firearms, the greater wolf population grew quickly, as much as 30% per year. With respect to the attacks on the Eastern Front in 1917, it is unknown whether the frozen and decomposing bodies were simply not enough to satisfy the hunger of a growing number of wolves. However, it otherwise seems that wolves do prefer a fresh meal, as much as humans might if they can find it, or so Will Graves indicates in his book. In addition, he writes that wolves sometimes indulge in the erratic behavior of surplus killing, rampaging through herds of animals, possibly even through groups of humans indiscriminately, killing every living thing they can find, even if it is more than they can eat, thus leaving the surplus carcasses behind. Keeping all of this in mind, the growing wolf population, the miserable weather, and the wolves' particular preferences for fresh meat, most unfortunately for those troops hunkered down in their shallow foxholes, it seems a growing taste for human flesh soon gave these wolves an uncontrollable urge to find living prey. Many of the Russian and German soldiers on the Eastern Front may or may not have been wary of a potential threat from wolves. Whether or not the harsh winter was a leading factor, further research would indicate that these were not the only accounts. Wolves attacking living humans during the war were illustrated by a published French lithograph printed in Paris in October of 1914. Attacks on soldiers had been documented as early as the first few months of the war. This particular lithograph print was part of a larger series titled La Grande Guerre, or The Great War. They were created throughout the war and meant to be sold as a collectible set. This one was titled In the Woods of Augustau. A Russian medic defends wounded German soldiers against furious wolf attacks, created from the testimony of an unknown German soldier. He was wounded during the Battle of Augustov in 1,914 inches northeast Poland, being nursed back to health in Russia. He recounted the following story of an enemy soldier's act of humanity in saving him during combat. A pack of wolves circled the battlefield, continuously dashing to the dead and wounded, devouring them. At one point, they heard gunshots. It was a Russian medic who fired constantly on a pack of wolves that was attacking one of their comrades named Felipe, and many of them were thus saved from a terrible death. Evidently, the lithograph is noted by art historians for its candid reporting. The caption goes on to condemn the German army for leaving their wounded men behind to suffer such a cruel death. While France and other European nations progressively eliminated their regional wolf populations through the early 20th century, whether modern environmentalists would find it was wholly unnecessary or not, the same does not appear to be true for the far more vast country of Russia. Unfortunately, for the citizens of the bucolic districts surrounding the city of Kirov, a number of man-eating wolf attacks would take place. These attacks occurred during World War II and over several years following the end of the conflict, from 1944 until 1953. The attacks resulted in the deaths of 22 children and teenagers between the ages of 3 and 17. It would seem, like those preceding wolves during World War I, the war itself gave rise to a dramatically increasing wolf population. In the Kirovsky Oblast region, wolf attacks were particularly severe, a fact that becomes easier to understand when considering the immense number of human bodies left available for wolves to consume. During the war, older men of fighting age and their weapons were drafted into the Soviet army. Research articles have cited that the Soviet Union's reported civilian death toll of approximately 7 million was intentionally underreported. A Soviet research committee formed in 1989 later estimated the true figure to be between 26 and 27 million. That number alone is shocking to contemplate, and it helps explain the high incidence of wolf attacks. It is uncertain whether similar attacks in other regions went unreported. The various massacres of World War II, the Holocaust, and other intentional or accidental killings of civilians and soldiers across Northern Europe and Russia likely augmented the wolves' food supply, leading to their unpredictable behavior toward humans. In his book, Will Graves, drawing on his study of Russian wolves, further notes that in the late 1940s, due to these and other wolf attacks, the Soviet Union commissioned a study by Russian biologist Peter Alexandrovich Montefiore. When first appointed to the study, Montefiore appears to have been very skeptical about the notion of wolves preying on humans, except in the case of erratic rabid wolves. His findings, published in November 1947, surprised him greatly as he discovered numerous attacks carried out by perfectly healthy animals. According to Graves, Soviet authorities immediately suppressed this report, keeping it from the public. The motive behind this cover-up was that after World War II, the Soviet government did not want to give its people any reason to fear wolves, which might lead them to demand weapons and potentially gain the power to overthrow the communist regime in a future revolution. To conclude, most of us will probably never encounter a wolf, and most wolves will go out of their way to avoid us. However, if we unexpectedly find ourselves in a dangerous situation, or with overly bold wolves, here are some helpful suggestions from the Finnish website, Large Carnivores to Prevent a Dangerous Encounter. First, try to move away. Do not run, even if that is your initial instinct. If escape is impossible, climb onto a high object such as a rock, or if you are near a settlement, onto a rooftop. You could also climb a tree. If the wolf continues acting threatening and you cannot leave, avoid direct contact. Remain as calm and fearless as possible. Always try to leave in any way you can, or get the wolf to leave you alone. If the wolf attacks or bites you, yell loudly, try to appear as large as you can, and wave your arms aggressively. Do not surrender. You need to either frighten the wolf away or fight it off to make it stop the attack. A wolf encountering strong resistance will back off. However, this holds true only for healthy wolves. Rabid wolves will likely continue attacking. If you encounter an aggressive wolf, contact emergency services right away. If the wolf behaves in a harmless way, report the sighting to your local wildlife management association.